Hidden Talents by David Lubar. Why I Like Being Me. Dominic Lucky Calabrese. Hey, what's not to like? I'm a fun guy and I'm very generous to my friends. So they like me too. Trash's fork shot a foot in the air, then fell and hit the edge of the table. It bounced from the table and clattered to the floor. As far as I could tell, nobody paid attention to the slight tinkle the cheap piece of metal made. They were used to throwing stuff. But he hadn't thrown it. For a stunned moment, I felt like a little kid watching his first magic show. A rush of excitement hit me with the force of an ocean wave. Telekinesis! I shouted, leaping from my chair. I couldn't believe that I'd missed the obvious explanation for so long. Trash was telekinetic. He could move stuff with his mind. He might not have any control over what he was doing, but he definitely had the power. "What did you say?" he asked. I said that. I stopped as images flooded back, angry faces of former friends reminding me what had happened when I told Torchy, Cheater, and Flinch about their powers. Not only had they refused to believe me, they turned against me. Trash wasn't my friend, he was just someone I'd share a table for 3 days. But I didn't want another enemy. I didn't want to cut myself off from this last human contact. This was pathetic. I couldn't believe how low I was sinking. "What?" he asked again. Nothing. I sat back down and finished my lunch. As the cafeteria cleared, I stayed in my seat and tried to make sense of everything I'd seen. My discovery of Trash's telekinesis meant there were 4 kids at Edgeview with psychic powers: Torchy, Flinch, Cheater, and Trash. Were there others? Lucky was always finding things. Was he lucky or was something more going on? I didn't know, but I needed to find out. I grabbed a notebook and started listing all of the kids I could think of who might have psychic powers. I decided that I'd write down absolutely anything I'd seen that was strange or unusual. I figured if I kept notes, I might discover some patterns. None of this would have been necessary if Cheater had cooperated. "One experiment," I muttered, slamming my fist on the table. "One stupid experiment. That's all I needed. If they just agreed to that, everything would have been fine." "What's up, Martin?" The voice caught me by surprise. I shut the notebook and looked up at Mr. Briggs. "What do you care? I heard you all spent a whole 10 seconds deciding my fate at your last meeting. I would have liked to take more time, but I don't think the results would have been any different." He shook his head and laughed. "I'll say this, you've certainly made an impression at Edgeview. You think this is funny?" "Sorry, no, I didn't mean to laugh. Look, we're trying to do the best for you, honest." Mr. Briggs walked to the other side of the table, pulled out a chair, turned it around backward, and plopped down. The knight in armor on his Rutgers t shirt peered over the back of the chair. "I'd have been happy to run him through with a lance if I had one." "Did I just hear you say my favorite word?" I stared at him. I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. Obviously, he wanted to change the subject. He didn't have the guts to talk about my review. Face to face, they were all cowards, honest. "Experiment," he said. I didn't answer. "Well, maybe I heard wrong." He stood up. "If you do happen to run an experiment, let me know how it goes. I'd be interested in your findings." "More than you'd believe," I thought as I watched him leave. When he reached the hallway, he turned back and said, "Better get going or you'll be late for class. Then you'll be in big trouble." He smiled when he said that. I guess he smiled because I had his class next. I didn't return the smile. He was just making a pathetic attempt to get me on my good side after stabbing me in the back. I waited for him to get far enough ahead so he wouldn't think I was following him, then gathered my books and headed to class. As I found a spot on the carpet, Mr. Briggs went to the blackboard and said, "I want to put aside our lesson and talk about something else. How many of you know how to design and run an experiment?" 1 or 2 kids raised their hands. Everyone else just sat there. The kids with their hands up looked around, then lowered their hands. Mr. Briggs nodded. "That's what I thought. The key to science is knowing how to design and carry out an experiment. Without that, everything else you've learned is useless. Of course, I'm sure some of you feel that it's all useless anyhow." That got a laugh from most of the kids. Mr. Briggs looked right at me. "Anyone want to suggest an experiment?" "How about you, Martin?" I shook my head. "Come on, Martin," he said. "Give it a try." "No." He shrugged. "Somebody else? Give me some ideas. What shall we investigate?" "Nuclear bombs!" Flynn shouted from the back of the room. "Maybe next year," Mr. Briggs said after the class had stopped laughing. "Right now, we're fresh out of uranium." Another suggestion came from behind me. This was one quieter. This one was quieter, spoken rather than shouted, but it might as well have blared through the speakers of the world's loudest rock band as far as I was concerned. "How about mind reading?" the voice asked. Why I like being me, Dennis Wu. Hey, what's not to like? I'm a fun guy, and I'm very generous to my friends, so they like me too. I stared at Cheater, who just made the suggestion. For an instant, I felt hope. Maybe he believed. Now that he'd had time to think about it, he must have realized I was right. Cheater smirked at me and my hopes vanished. I realized this was his own private joke. I didn't think he was being very funny. At least there was no way Mr. Briggs would go far for something like that. A science teacher wouldn't mess around with psychic stuff. Excellent suggestion, Dennis, Mr. Briggs said. He strolled across the room to give Chester a pat on the head, then returned to the board and wrote mind reading in big letters. Whatever Cheater's motives, this was perfect. If the whole class proved I was right, Cheater couldn't blame me. That's not science, Lucky said. Let's pick something else. Anything can be investigated scientifically, Mr. Briggs told him. He turned back to the class. I want each of you to try to come up with an experiment that we could use to test for mind reading. Is this homework? Torchy asked. Mr. Briggs nodded. Sure, let's say that this is your assignment. Take a few days. We'll wait until Monday to see what everyone comes up with. To help you out, I will tell you about some famous experiments that scientists have carried out in the past. He spent the rest of the period talking about Newton, Galileo, and other scientists. But I had a hard time paying attention. I was thinking about what would happen when the class started running the experiments. On the way out, I caught up with Cheater and asked, "What did you do that for?" "Just to show you how wrong you are," he said. "I'm not wrong, you'll see. Why can't you accept the truth? What are you scared of?" "I'm not scared of anything," he said, but there was something in his eyes that told me he was lying. Before I could say anything else, he rushed away. I continued my search for other kids with special powers. I saw a lot of strange stuff during the rest of the day, though most of it was just bad behavior. But I did see a couple of things worth writing down. Lucky found two pencils, 3 dimes, and a candy bar, all in a single afternoon. That's just when I was watching. Who knows what else he found? He never acted surprised. It seemed like he just knew where stuff was. By the end of the day, I had a list of 7 more kids who might have some kind of psychic powers. By Friday, the list had grown to over 2 dozen. I had plenty of time to study my notes on Friday evening. Torchy had skipped into town with his friends. He hadn't said a word when he left the room. I couldn't understand them. If someone told me I had a special ability, I'd be thrilled. It'd be great to know what people were thinking or to know what was going to happen. It would be extremely cool to move things with my mind or see the future. But there was no point daydreaming about that. I didn't have any special talents, except maybe the power to get my teachers so angry they'd strap me to a chair and shock me or slam my head against a wall. I'm sure Dad would have approved of that form of education. At least I'd finish my week of detention without further pain. I was still awake when Torchy came back from town. I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this. "You guys going to stay mad at me forever?" I asked. He sat down and looked at the magazines on his desk. Then he glanced out the window. His eyes flickered in my direction once or twice, but quickly bounced away. I realized it might be as rough for him as it was for me. He was so eager to be friends with the whole world. He must hate having to be enemies with anyone, especially someone he had to share a room with. "We aren't mad," he finally mumbled. "Yeah, you are." Torchy shrugged and studied his picture of Mars. "Well, maybe a little. Look, don't expect me to start begging." He stared down at his sneakers. "Maybe if you knocked off all this crazy stuff about mind reading." "It's not crazy. I stopped. Did I want to be right or did I want to have friends? It didn't seem fair that I had to choose, but that's the way it had worked out. I wouldn't I couldn't look somewhere else for friends. I was stuck at Edgeview, stuck here for good now, thanks to Mr. Briggs and the other teachers. Was it really that important to prove I was right? "Can we just forget the whole thing?" I asked. I wouldn't say another word until the experiment proved I was right. Torchy looked at me out of the sides of his eyes. "That would be great." I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until then. Ever since they'd gotten angry, I'd been walking around like a stretched out rubber band. Now I could feel my whole body relax. "I'm really sorry about what I said to you." "That's okay. I'm not mad, honest." I felt I had to do something special. I went to my desk and fished around in the bottom drawer until I found what I was looking for. "Here, I want you to have this." I held out my peace offering, hoping it would make Torchy happy. Letters to the editor, the Edgeview Express, dated the previous Monday. Dear Editor, Those who've been following the issue know the legislator is considering a merger of the regional alternative schools. Such a move would benefit all of the citizens of our town. I urge everyone to call their state representatives and let them know how we feel. Gordon Blathwell. Torchy's eyes lit up. Okay, maybe that was a bad choice of words, but I could tell he was excited. Wow, a harmonica, he said, taking the gift. I've always wanted one. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure. My sister gave it to me last April for my birthday. I think it was her idea of a joke. I never learned to play it. I just threw it in my bag when I packed. Guess I threw it in for you. It was the perfect gift for him. As far as I could tell, it was pretty much fireproof except for the little reeds on the inside of each hole. And they tended to get pretty spitty, so they'd be safe as soon as he started playing. But you didn't even know me back then. I was about to say, maybe I'm psychic, but I caught myself. It wasn't a good time for that kind of joke. Torchy blew into the harmonica, producing a batch of random notes, then pulled it away from his mouth and smiled. Great, did you recognize that? Give me a clue. It was Oh Susanna, he said. Right, yeah, now I recognize it. Good job. I got the sinking feeling I just created a monster. Too bad I can't play and sing at the same time. That would be cool. Yeah, too bad. Torchy spent the next hour or so happily making noises with the harmonica. Some of the notes even sort of resembled songs if you didn't listen too closely. At least he wasn't angry with me anymore. The next day at breakfast, it seemed as if an invisible signal had been sent to the other kids. Maybe it was the sight of Torchy and me standing together in line. Anyhow, Cheater and Flinch and Lucky once again recognized my existence. Except for a layer of coolness that I knew would eventually melt, everything was headed back the way it was before. Almost everything. As I sat down with them, I snuck a guilty look at Trash alone at his table. Maybe he expected me to sit with him. He glanced toward me. I thought about asking him to join us, but I just patched things up with the others. I didn't think it was the right time. I felt like a rat. I'd used him when I needed company, and now I'm abandoning him. Maybe that should be my nickname, Martin the Rat. As rotten as I felt about Trash, the rottenness was diluted by relief. I was back from exile. Even though I decided to keep my mouth shut, I still kept my eyes open for anything unusual. But by Monday, when I went to Mr. Briggs' class, I hadn't found any suspects to add to my list. Maybe his lecture on scientific methods had made me look at things more carefully. If you want to see something badly enough, you're going to see it even if it isn't there. All right, class, Mr. Briggs said, once we'd all gotten comfortable. Let's hear your ideas for experiments. Bloodbath spoke out. I figured I could decide to hit someone. If he stayed in the room, we know he didn't read my mind. He chuckled. Then he smashed one fist onto the floor. Very interesting, Mr. Briggs said, but I don't know how scientific that would be. The class discussed ideas. A couple of the kids had heard about Zener cards, though they didn't know them by that name. I did because of the reading I'd done. A standard set has 5 different symbols: a square, a star, wavy lines, and a couple of other things. There are 5 of each, so a deck has 25 cards. One person looks at a card, and the other person tries to read his mind and say what the card is or guess the card before anyone sees it. The rest of the class leaped on the idea of the cards. Even though I knew more about the subject than anyone in the room, I kept my mouth shut. I really wanted to stay out of it, and I didn't want to give Mr. Briggs the satisfaction of thinking he's gotten me involved. Okay, Mr. Briggs said when the discussion started to die down. We all seem to like the cards, but we still need to design the experiment. How should we do it? We have to switch around, Flitch said, so we get as many combinations of kids as possible. Great, said Mr. Briggs. The more pairs we test, the more data we gather. It it would take a long time if we ran every possible pairing, so we can't do that. But we can run tests for a day or two and see how many we can get done. But first, we have to make the cards. I'll bring in some supplies tomorrow and we can pitch in to assemble the decks. Then we can run tests on Wednesday and Thursday. Friday, we can examine our results. He walked back to the blackboard and picked up where he'd left off on the regular lesson. I didn't have to be a mind reader to tell that most of the kids were excited about the experiment. Cheater, who was chattering away with Flinch, seemed as excited as everyone else. I guess he was sure the test would prove he didn't have any special talents. As it turned out, the one absolute thing the experiment proved was that I couldn't see into the future. Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Briggs dumped a bag full of playing cards in the classroom floor. Pair up, take 25 cards. He passed out sheets of paper with the five symbols printed on them. I guess he designed the pages on the computer. He also passed out glue and those blunt scissors, the kind people give little kids so they don't hurt themselves or someone else. Get to work, he said. We started making the decks, gluing the symbols onto the faces of the playing cards. There was a square, a star, a plus sign, a minus sign, and a wavy line. Why can't we just use the pieces of paper? Torchy asked. Anyone? Mr. Briggs asked the class. The backs have to be identical, Flint said. Right, Mr. Briggs nodded. If there are any difference in the shapes of the cards, the test results aren't valid. We made up all the cards we needed by the end of the class. The next day, we started the test. Before we began, Mr. Briggs gave us some instructions. The tester has to keep score. Get out a piece of paper. Every time the subject makes a guess, write either H for a hit or M for a miss, but don't let the other person see the card, even after he's guessed. That information could be used to help make the next guess. When you finish the test, count up the hits and misses. I wrote a program to keep track of the scores. Go to the computer, select the name of the sender and receiver, and enter how many hits you recorded. He paused for a moment. I guess he was waiting to see if there were questions. Nobody said anything. Okay, pair up and let's get started. For the first test, I was paired with Lucky. I got 6 right, Lucky got 5 right. But that was about what I expected. There were 5 different symbols, so each guess had one chance in 5 of being right. With 25 cards, a person who was just guessing blindly would be right about 5 times. A person might beat the odds and guess right 6 or 7 times, maybe even 8, but only someone who could really read minds would get a high score like 15 or 20. Pick another partner, Mr. Briggs said after everyone had finished the first pair of experiments. I found myself with one of the runts. I got 5 hits, so did he. Right on the average for each of us. On the last round of the day, as everyone scrambled for partners, I took too long making up my mind. There was only one person left. Cheater looked at me from across the room. I'd avoided him so far. I just didn't want to be part of the proof. That way, he couldn't blame me. But now I had no choice. I'll go first, he said. You be the tester. He seemed happy we were working together and eager to get started. I reached for the top card. It took me 2 tries to get a grip on it. I stared at the figure on the face of the card. Square, I thought, trying to imagine a giant square. Star, Cheater guessed. I wrote M on the pad to record the miss and picked up the next card. It was a cross. Wavy lines, Cheater guessed. That's how it went. As each card slid off the deck, I felt a little more of my confidence drain away. Cheater missed every single one. At first, I was disappointed. But as I entered the scores in the computer, I felt a bit relieved too. It all had to be my imagination. Maybe it was time to forget the whole thing. I got 7 right when Cheater tested me. Hey, it looks like you're the mind reader, he said, grinning. I held back a nasty reply. He was just trying to be friendly. That was the last test we had time for that period. We ran another 3 sets on Thursday. By then, everyone was talking about the experiment. I got 8 once, Torchy said, but another time I just got 3. It balances out, I told him. If you ran one test, just about anything could happen. One test doesn't mean much at all. If you ran 10 tests, you'd probably come close to the average. But if you ran 1,000 tests, you'd get even closer. I wanted to explain it more about averages, but I stopped when I noticed his eyes start to glaze over. My own words lingered in my mind. One test doesn't mean much at all. I wondered whether my one test with Cheater was a fluke. Maybe he'd score higher with other people. I would find out soon enough. The next day, everyone seemed eager to hear the results. Well, class, Mr. Briggs said, we have some interesting numbers. He had the computer keyboard in his lap. First, let's see if anyone scored higher than we expected, since that's the whole point of our investigation. I'll pull up a list of subjects who averaged better than 5 hits on their test. We all crowded around the monitor. A bunch of names scrolled up. I could feel a wave of excitement pass through the room. Nobody, except for me, had ever expected any sort of special results, and I definitely hadn't expected more than one mind reader to show up in the class. Now, let's check the specific details, Mr. Briggs said. He hit a few more keys. The screen changed. We seemed to have 2 groups that had high scores. Robert, Justin, and Trevor all did better than average. I'll put up the results and see what you think. I looked at the information. Each of the 3 had scored a perfect round of 25 hits. That was amazing. Then I noticed something else. Each had only done it once. And in every case, the tester was the same. Avery Morrison, one of the runts. Squinty, a couple of kids said, called Avery by his nickname, they'd realized the pattern at the same time I did. Everyone turned toward him. Squinty looked back, peering at us through his thick glasses. What's everyone staring at? Mr. Briggs handed him a deck of the test cards. Hold one up, but don't let me see it. Avery held up a card, raising it close to his face. No, not here, Mr. Briggs said. Let's go over to where you usually sit. The light's better over there. He followed Squinty to a corner of the rug near a window. After they sat down, Mr. Briggs tilted his head a bit, as if searching for something, and then said, minus sign. Yes, Squinty said, you got it. Square, Mr. Briggs said for the second card. Wow, right again, Squinty told him. Another square. Yup, star. Holy smokes, you got another one. Mr. Briggs named a couple more cards before Squinty caught on. By then, the rest of us were laughing hard enough to split a gut. It was like watching a magic act. Robert, Justin, and Trevor, who each had done the same thing during the actual test, were laughing the hardest of all. Finally, Mr. Briggs, who was laughing too, said, This is a great lesson. It shows one way an experiment can go wrong. In this case, nobody intended to cheat, but I suspect that the opportunity was just irresistible to the three of you who noticed the reflection on Avery's glasses. Of course, the instant we saw perfect scores, we should have become suspicious. As Mr. Briggs said this, I heard Bloodbath say, Darn. Then Bloodbath started looking around like he was thinking about leaving the room. Mr. Briggs, staring at Bloodbath, said, So someone who wanted to be really clever while cheating shouldn't get perfect scores. It would be a lot better to miss a couple of times. He went back to the computer and pulled up some more information. He didn't say anything about the data. He just pointed to a column of numbers on the screen. I think everyone understood what was going on right away. Bloodbath had gotten 4 perfect scores, but the tester in each case had been one of his buddies. They'd obviously cheated just for the sake of cheating. Maybe they thought it was a good joke. Maybe they were so used to cheating whenever they could that they just naturally done it during the test. But as Mr. Briggs had pointed out, they hadn't been clever enough. Now, let's throw out these cases and look at the rest of our results. Let's see who did better than 5 right. He tapped a few more keys. As you can see, nobody managed to score 6 hits per test. The highest average was 5.76, roughly 5 and 3/4. So at least as far as this experiment is concerned, we have no real evidence of psychic ability. That was it then. Scientific proof that I had been wrong. I heard Cheater snicker. Then he caught me looking at him and said, Sorry. I guess he hadn't meant to laugh at me. That was okay. I sort of deserved it. As a matter of fact, Mr. Briggs said, the average for the entire class, once we throw out the bad data, is just a bit better than 4.5 hits. I suspect it would be a lot closer to 5 if we ran more tests. But we've done enough to learn a few things, and that, my friend, should always be the point of one of these exercises. The class spent the rest of the period discussing the tests and the results. Mr. Briggs talked about ways to design a better experiment and ways to prevent cheating. Apparently, that was a big problem. Sometimes people wanted to prove something so badly that they cheated when they ran a test. In a way, I was relieved that they'd run an actual scientific test and it had shown no evidence that anyone could read minds. I could get on with my life and stop driving myself crazy with wild ideas about that kind of stuff. As I left class, I shook my head thinking about how stupid Bloodbath had been when he tried to get away with those perfect scores. It was funny how he'd given himself away by cheating too successfully. But that led me to another thought. It came to me so suddenly that I wanted to dash right back into the room. Instead, I waited until Mr. Briggs left. The program was still up on the computer. Even better, the file with the results was open. I pulled down the menu and sent the data to the printer. It was the old kind that makes a lot of noise and spits out a single line at a time. I watched the pages as they inched out, revealing something I'd almost missed. My hand shook so badly I ripped the edge of the last sheet as I tore it from the printer. There was no doubt about it, no mistake. I had definite proof. I wasn't sure if I wanted it, but I had it. The question was, what should I do with it? The data shows out of all 6 trials that Cheater had, he scored a 0 every single time. The smart thing would have been to just forget what I knew. There was no way they'd want to hear this. But if I'd been good at doing the smart thing, I wouldn't have ended up at Edgeview. I waited until that evening when Flinch, Lucky, and Cheater were in the room with Torchy and me. Then I waited until they started talking about science class. That didn't take too long. You know, Cheater said, I'd bet that Mr. Briggs could get fired for that experiment. You're crazy, Torchy said. No, he's right, Lucky said. Any of that kind of different stuff, they get real funny about. In my last school, this teacher explained some things to us about witches. It wasn't bad stuff, just how some people had certain beliefs. She didn't swallow any of it herself. None of us did. She just told us about it, and she got fired. Exactly, Cheater said. Mr. Briggs would get in big trouble. But it was worth it, I said. They'd all turned toward me. I pulled the printout from my notebook and scanned it again to boost my courage. Now that I'd started, I had to convince them. If I failed, they'd probably hate me forever. Think about this, I said. What would your score be if you answered the same thing each time? What if for each of the 25 guesses you said square, suddenly I had a very good idea how a parachutist felt the first time he jumped out of a plane? I could almost feel myself hurtling through the air. My stomach sure seemed to believe I was plunging toward a cannon filled with jagged rocks. I waited for my parachute to open. But there aren't 25 squares, Torchy said. Right, Flinch said, there are five. So you'd score 5 out of 25. That's 1 out of 5, or 20%. You'd be right at the average. I took a deep breath. Here it comes. This was the leap I was thinking I had to help them make. It was obvious to me, but I was good at math. So was Flinch. Cheater was too, but I knew he wouldn't do anything to help me. Torchy might have trouble following the explanation, but if I could convince the others, he'd go along with them. Now, I said, looking at Cheater, is there any way to make sure you get a lower score? Can you think of anything you could do to make sure you'd only get 4 right, or 3, or 2? You could, Torchy started to say. Then I guess he stopped to think. Cheater remained silent. So did Lucky. Can't be done, Flinch said. There's no way to average less than 5 hits in the long run. Whether you just said square each time or if you mix them up, you'd still hit 1 out of 5 in the long run, no matter what. So, I said, not taking my eyes from Cheater, how could someone miss every card, not just in one test, but 6 times in a row? That's impossible, Flinch said. You'd have to get some of them right just by chance. As Flinch spoke, Cheater looked away from me. Unless you know what the right answer was, I said. If you knew the right answer, but you wanted to prove you didn't, it would be easy to get every answer wrong. Easy, but not a good way to hide your ability. Mr. Briggs was interested in kids who got more than 5 right. He didn't bother to look at the other side. Kids who got less than 5. I held up the printout and pointed at Cheater's scores. Wow, you're right, Flinch said, grabbing the printout from my hand. It would be impossible to miss every one unless you knew what the right answers were. Maybe, just maybe, you could miss all the cards on one test, but on every test, give me a break. Even Torchy saw that I was right. Cheater, you can read minds. Cheater shook his head. No, I can't. Mr. Briggs didn't say anything. He could have said something. Mr. Briggs was looking for hits, not misses, I said. You should be glad he was. If he'd noticed your score, he'd have known right away that something was wrong. But Cheater looked around the room. Lucky, you don't believe this nonsense, do you? Lucky just shrugged. Flinch, Cheater said. You can't swallow this stuff. It makes perfect sense to me, Flinch said. Numbers don't lie. Cheater turned to Torchy. Come on, Torchy, he said. At least you believe me. I can't read minds. And even if I could, I never tell anyone about your secret hiding place. Torchy gasped. How'd you know? That's just what I was thinking. He stared at Cheater for a moment, then looked around at the rest of us. I was worried that Cheater would read my mind and know where I hid my favorite comics. I could see it in their faces. They believed. Torchy was sure now. There was no doubt in his face, just wonder and amazement. The same with Lucky and Flinch. I watched Cheater. I expected him to be angry or happy. Instead, he looked like he was about to cry. I don't want to be different, he said quietly. But you are, I told him. Hey, everyone is different in some way, right? Not this different, Cheater said. No choice, Flinch told him. You are what you are. You gotta live with it. There's this guy in my town, Cheater said. Everyone calls him Crazy Wally. He walks around talking to himself. He heard voices. People laughed at him. Kids teased him. One day, the voice told him to get even. He killed 3 people before the police shot him. Cheater stared right at me. I'm not crazy. Hey, nobody said you were. I began to understand his anger and fear. You don't hear voices. You aren't walking around talking to yourself. That's not what it's like, is it? Cheater shook his head. He started to speak again, but it took several tries. I didn't want to believe it. He looked down at the floor. We all waited quietly. Finally, he went on. Sometimes I guess I just know stuff. It's not like I hear it. I can't pick through people's brains. I guess I only get what someone is actually thinking. It's like their thoughts show up in my mind. Like a memory, I asked. Yeah, that's it, Cheater said. But I know stuff on my own too. I'm really smart. Ask me anything, anything at all. Hey, relax. We know you're smart, I told him. You're probably the smartest kid I've ever met. Cheater smacked his leg with his fist. But sometimes I can't tell it apart, the stuff I learned and the stuff that pops up. So you're not even sure where it's coming from, I said. That explained his problems in school. When you're taking a test, you think the ideas are from your own mind. You don't hear the thoughts of the kids next to you. The thoughts are just there in your mind. Yeah, I guess. Flint started to laugh. What's so funny? Cheater asked. All your life, you've never cheated, right? Flinch asked. Cheater nodded. Never, not until the experiment. So after all that, after a whole lifetime of being honest, when you finally decide to cheat, you're so bad at it, you get caught right away. Flint rolled on the floor, laughing so hard he started to gasp for breath. Cheater laughed too. Then his face grew serious and he looked around the room. I don't try to spy on anyone. I really can't. We know, Lucky said. He put a hand on Cheater's shoulder. I trust you. Hey, don't worry, Torchy said. We aren't afraid of you or nothing. Honest. You aren't crazy, and you aren't the only one with special powers, I said. They all turned back to me. I felt like I was jumping out of another plane. You aren't going to start that again, are you? Torchy asked. No, I said. I'll just sit here and let you set your chair on fire. I pointed toward his left hand. Youch! Torchy jumped up from his seat. On the arm of the chair, where he'd rest his fingers against the wood, a smoldering spot gave up a small wisp of smoke. Who did that? You did, Torchy, I said. Somehow you can start fires. There's no other explanation. Torchy stepped away from his chair as the glowing area dimmed and then vanished, leaving a charred blotch. He didn't say anything. I turned toward Flinch. What do I have to do? Throw stuff at you? Come on, Flinch. This is the time. Cheater has stopped lying to himself. So has Torchy. Well, as you just said, you got to learn to live with it. You're right, and I guess I got to talk about it. Stuff speeds up sometimes, Flinch said. I see something about to hit me, so I jump out of the way. Then everything slows down until the world catches up. But I've already gotten out of the way. That's how it's been my whole life. I figured it was kind of like that for everyone, or else I was some kind of freak. You're seeing into the future, I told him. Not very far, but definitely into the future. That's why you always have the flipper ready in time when you play pinball. No, that can't be it. Flinch stopped. He couldn't seem to think up another explanation. And you have a talent for finding things, I told Lucky. I'm not sure what it means. Maybe you sense the objects, or maybe you sense some sort of mark left on the object by the owner. I don't know. But it sure isn't a skill everyone has. Lucky shrugged. I've always figured I was just lucky. You are, I said. You all are. As much as I should have been thrilled that they finally believed me, there was a sad side I couldn't ignore. I guess I felt left out. They had these wonderful abilities. I had nothing. But at least I could help one more person, someone I treated pretty rottenly. There are others, I said. Who? Lucky asked. Well, I'm not positive in some of the cases, but there's one person I'm absolutely sure about. Hang on, I'll go get him. I went down the hall and knocked on Trash's door. What? He asked when I stepped inside. There are some kids down the hall who want to meet you, I said. Is this your idea of a joke? He asked. No joke, I said. Promise. Why would they want to meet me? He asked. Let's just say you have a lot in common. I turned toward the door, then stopped. Well? Trash shrugged and got up. I could understand that he'd want to be cautious, but as he crossed the room, I thought I saw the slightest hint of a smile on his lips. Unfinished letter from Dorothy Anderson. Dear Martin, I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. The house feels different without you here. Everyone misses you, especially your sister. Your father misses you too, of course. Dot dot dot.